Yeah, thank you all for coming. My name's Chris Rees. I'm the policy manager at the Down Syndrome Association. And this is actually the last of our series of conversations, webinars we've been putting on throughout March as part of the Down Syndrome Awareness Week and World Down Syndrome Day. If you haven't seen some of the others, some really great stuff we put out this month, ranging from conversations with the cast and crew of Ralph and Katie, Sally Phillips talking to Ruben and Manny Coe about their book, which I'm sure lots of you are familiar with. Anti-Bullying Alliance did one last week. So all the recordings are on our YouTube channel. So do have a look. We've got a great lineup of guests tonight to talk about the very complex issue of what makes an inclusive school. Quick introductions. Alex Stafford from IPSEA. Alex is a solicitor in IPSEA's legal team, and I'm sure all of you will know IPSEA. It's the Independent Parental Special Education Advice. It's a charity. If you're not familiar, I'd strongly recommend getting on their website, having a look at the resources. I've certainly used their resources many times in the last 11 years or so. Alex is responsible for delivering training to new and existing volunteers and delivering IPSEA's program of external training to parents, schools, SEN specialists, and local authorities. Alex also creates some of IPSEA's legally based written resources, and Alex has a son with autism and dyspraxia. And I believe on the IPSEA website, it says you're very good at making jam as well. So that's even better. That's very impressive list. Next up, Nancy Gedge. Nancy's a SENCO, a writer, both for organizations including the Times Educational Supplement and Special Needs Jungle. She's an author. Correct me if I'm wrong, Nancy. Inclusion for Primary School Teachers, available still, I believe, in all good bookshops and Amazon, and a blogger. Nancy's also a parent of a young man, well, not so young now, I think, but a youngish man with Down syndrome. And our final guest is Tom Rees. Tom's the Executive Director of Programs at the Ambition Institute. He's served as a member of his Regional Head Teachers Board, is a trustee of a local multi-academy trust, and he's also a former head teacher and an educational director. Tom's also the parent of a young man with Down syndrome and is the founding trustee of Ups and Downs, a local charity supporting children and adults with Down syndrome and their families. So yeah, I would normally ask you to introduce yourselves, but I think you'd all be too modest. So I wanted to really spell out what a fantastic panel of people we've got tonight. So yeah, and really what we're looking at tonight is not a sort of, how to educate children with Down syndrome at school or how to work directly with children with special needs. It's really looking at what makes inclusion work or not. What is it about the culture, the ethos, the practice of a school that really makes it the right place for our children and young people? So let me hand over to Alex, if you would like to start.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Really nice to be here. I do have a few slides because I don't think I could cope without a few slides, but I promise you that it's literally two of any import. So I'm absolutely thrilled to have been asked along tonight. Obviously, it wouldn't be, IPSEA if I didn't talk a tiny little bit about the law and how that makes for an inclusive school, but it really will be a tiny mention, because one of the reasons that I was so pleased to be here is that we have been recipients of a really inclusive education. My son has been in mainstream to receive that, but with an EHC plan since before he started primary school. And so it's really my experience of what I felt has made that work. I mean, I know how the law should work, but what I feel has made that work in terms of inclusivity. So this is literally the content that I was going to talk about this evening. On the left-hand side, I have put, how does that happen? And obviously, the law and complying with the law is a major part of ensuring that children and young people are included. And so that's just really, you can see that there's a myriad of duties that build a framework of law and regulation that support inclusivity. The Children and Families Act obviously is a key part of that in the mainstream and special sector. You'll see there that quite a few of the duties are to do with mainstream, because most children who have special educational needs in mainstream settings don't have an EHC plan. So it's those obligations that knit together. And it's things like, including children in the activities of the school, supporting those who've got medical conditions. And obviously the local authority has a role there as well. If they've got an EHC plan, it's the local authority's job to make sure that that provision gets delivered. But obviously all settings have, duties not to discriminate on the basis of disability under the Equality Act, and some of those are anticipatory. So those all knit together, along with just applying schools' own policies about things like behaviour and attendance lawfully. Obviously, there's statute applicable to state sector schools, but independent schools also have to have lawful policies. So that all builds that regulatory framework that, if followed, should ensure that children are included. But really for this evening, the key thing that I wanted to talk about was just my experience of what has made my son's education so inclusive. And they're not in any sort of order of priority, but these are the things that I really, thinking about how to explain it, this is what I've experienced that's been so helpful. And really it all has stemmed, in my experience, from really supportive senior leadership. So that includes the governing body, or the trust, but clearly, it is the leadership from the head teacher and the SENCO, and setting the tone for all the rest of the staff, not just in recruiting staff directly working with my child, but, just that tone of seeing my child as an integral part of the school community, just as any other child is. And obviously that might mean sometimes meeting my child where he has been or is, not to try to say this is the way we do things and he has to fit, but recognizing that there may be movement towards that, and there also may be things where we meet him where he is. And just that's part and parcel of that acceptance and tone that was set. And, ensuring through doing that he had the same sort of opportunities to participate as anyone else would have had, that everything was open, to him. And I wanted to recognize that is not something that schools are always rewarded for in the things that they're publicly rewarded for. The amount of effort that goes into that doesn't always yield measurable results in terms of things like results and things like, attendance or things like that. But obviously, it's been so important. Empathy, really empathetic support of my child in terms of seeing his school experience from his perspective. And again, that's set from the SEN team in particular around him. And obviously at primary, that was only a few people, and at secondary, that's been a lot more people. But this idea of we try and see things from the way he's seeing it, and that's how we look at things. But also a listening ear, open-minded, willingness to learn, not approaching it from we know how to do this and this is the way we deal with it, but we will see how all of our students who have SEN, what that means and how we deal with them. We can build on experience we have, but this willingness that this might be something new that we don't know how to deal with, or we don't know what the answer is. And collaborative approach, where that happens, not just with family, although that's a really key relationship, building this sort of mutual trust and respect. So, you do trust one another and you trust one another's views and you listen. I know that's not always possible. It depends on, who they are, but other professionals and that cooperative, collaborative relationship. And I'm fortunate because I've had external professionals who've said to me, we are so impressed by how great the setting is, like they're actually wanting us to tell them how to do things, like, and work with us, not, well, this is very nice information, we'll just take it and do what we normally do. Real collaboration with external people who have to get involved. this idea of proactive problem solving has been really helpful. You know, that I have had issues and the school have had issues where my child isn't seen as the problem. It's seen as there is an issue here that we have to work to find a solution to sort out. And we will do that together, or we will help, in some cases, me do that. Things that aren't even school-based, like top tips on how to help, things like getting his immunizations and accessing the kind of support that might be necessary to do that. That goes well beyond just, you know, inclusivity within the school community, but just, you know, really proactive help. So that's really been my experience of how that works. And I know that complying with the I could point to a number of, you know, things where you're like, that is an illustration of one of these points on the left, but it's also compliance with the law. I know that that's what it is, but it really has seemed to stem from this, this senior leadership role in terms of our pupils with SEN are integral, and we are going to try to make sure that we give them the best chance that they can have to fulfill their potential, which is what you want for any child in any setting. And we know that that might have its challenges, and we'll meet them. And that has been really a real approach that we have experienced. And I think it's made such a difference to certainly my child's education. And they didn't approach it as a problem. Although I know that they may have had some issues early on where they perhaps thought, I wonder if this is actually going to work and how we deal with these issues. But it was always a case of, well, this is part of our job and we will tackle it. So it's been a very charmed experience, I have to say. I know from the work I do that not all families or children experience that, but I really think those were the things that made the difference. We're going to be asked about this later, but I did do a slide anyway, just to flag, if there's one thing I can have people take away about the SEND and AP improvement plan, is just that the legal framework that I talked about just before hasn't changed and won't be changing. So it's really just to bear that in mind, that underpinning framework will continue. So there's nothing changing in terms of the law around how children should be included. And that's really all I had to say. I'm going to hand back to Chris at that point.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex. What a fantastic start. Yeah, I mean, I would, you know, it would be trust IPSEA to make sure that the law is front and center, which is absolutely right. But it's an interesting start of that balance for all of us as parents of, yes, we need the law to be ensuring, you know, to fall back on, but actually it's also about that practice and that, and like you say, from the very top down, about how they see our children as well.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that. And I completely agree. I mean, I think that, you know, we will talk about the SEND review very, very briefly later, but I think as a overarching thing, the law isn't changing is a really important thing everyone needs to understand as this goes forward. Great. Nancy, over to you.
So I guess I'll start by telling you a little bit about where I come from, the journey that I've been on. So you'll understand a little bit about where my perspective is coming from. So, as Chris said, my name's Nancy Gedge, and I'm just a common garden teacher, really. That's how I see myself, really. But I have an uncommon child. You know, I was like everybody is, was going to just go and have a baby. That was quite a simple thing, and my baby rocked up in the world with a little bit extra, which meant that I had to think a little bit extra hard about how we were going to approach his education. And being a teacher, I obviously thought that education was the most important thing and was the thing that was going to change the world. And so I've been on quite a journey. So as well as being the mother to a young man, he's now 22, with Down syndrome, and as well as being a primary school teacher, I'm now a qualified SENCO. Like many SENCOs, I've partly fallen into it and partly gone into it because of a family connection. And I am now no longer a primary school teacher. I now run it's a resource base, a local authority resource base for physically disabled children and those with a communication and interaction need, which is often but not including autism. And that's in a secondary school. So having travelled through education and out the other side with my 22-year-old, I'm also getting the experience of working in a variety of settings. And that's given me a different perspective. A while ago, almost 10 years ago now, I've got my husband to go and find it. I wrote this book here, which was really my thoughts at the time about how a teacher themselves could be inclusive in their practice. But working in a middle management, I guess, that I am in a secondary school, it's given me a different perspective, because it's not all about the teacher. Yes, the teacher is important, and yes, the teacher matters, but if you want a really inclusive school, you need the structures around it to support it to be that. You need a good curriculum. So in the education news, or in education policy, there's a big focus on curriculum, but it's a very narrow one. And I know that my son has severe learning difficulties. That's just the reality of it. And he could try GCSEs until the cows came home, but they would mean nothing to him, and he would feel a failure. And I see this in my workplace, and I see this in the school in general. He's not alone in this, that there needs to be a curriculum that children can access. There needs to be a curriculum that is suitable for all, that is a joyful thing, as interesting, and they're able to do it and come out the other side with a qualification that is valued. So alongside that curriculum, there also needs to be the support systems that are around schools, advisory teachers. You know, these people are incredibly stretched, and frankly, there needs to be more of them. So in order for a school to be really inclusive, having someone to turn to who has taken the time to study, to gain extra qualifications and skills and experience, who's like me now. I didn't ever think I would be one of the older members of staff in a school, but I am now one of those people who can be that person who the young teacher, or, you know, a teacher who's not come across any form of disability in their life or in their professional life, they can turn to for advice, for good quality, good quality recommendations and observations of their practice and all that sort of thing. So you need those advisory teams. You need good, decent resources in a school. Now, I work in the world of physical disability these days, but I can see that a lot of that stuff matters and would have mattered to my son as he was in school. Classes that are not too overcrowded, that's a big deal. You've got many young people with, and I think my son was probably one of these, have, issues with sensory overload in a mainstream classroom setting. So that building needs looking at. The physical space that children are in, that we are expecting them to learn in, matters. I spent a long 4 years as an SEN teacher at a primary school. The number of days, or the years I spent in damp little corners, in funny little bits of the corridor, made me seriously question what we are doing with our most vulnerable learners. To put it in teacher speak, sorry, it's my world, so I end up with the jargon. What are we doing? How are we enabling children with profound special needs who really need a teacher to be with their teacher? So much of it seems to centre around the TA. So again, I would look at TAs. Are we training TAs? Or are we just recruiting people who have a good heart but don't know about schools and maybe don't have a good level of qualification? Maybe they do. It's great if they do, but not always. So are we looking at the structure of how we're recruiting and training TAs, and how we're recruiting and training teachers in order to work with other adults? Because certainly when I qualified as a teacher, it was about how you deliver a curriculum, how you control the class, I'm so old, it was how you write on the chalkboard, how you put a display up. But nobody taught me how to teach how to lead adults. And that's what you're doing when you're working with teaching assistants. How do you do that? So it's these sorts of structures, social care. Maybe in the world that I work in now, there are, with physically disabled children, there are families who really, really struggle. But I know that this happens in my personal life too. Are there enough social workers to support our families with a child with a disability? This work is vastly done by schools. Can we really be inclusive if our school structures are taken up with doing the work of social care, or even the work of CAMS and mental health professionals? So I would say that this structures, the physical structures, the physical resources, the personnel and the curriculum all goes towards making an inclusive school. And I'm sitting over all of that, and it's been in the news recently because of an awful situation that happened in a school that's actually reasonably local to me, is the role of Ofsted and accountability. Because I don't believe that we've got that right. We have an accountability system that essentially turns the schools into a competition. Who can get the best results? So we are building into the system that we want to put our children in. We are building in a perverse incentive. We are making head teachers personally accountable, and then we're saying you are accountable for pass marks. Does that make an inclusive school? No, it doesn't. So if we can look again at, because schools should be held accountable. I wanted my son's primary school to be accountable for what they were doing and what they were, the mess they were making of my son's education. I really wanted that. But the accountability, the searchlight was looking somewhere else. It was looking at a different place. I want the schools to be accountable for the money that they spend. TAs cost a lot of money. I want them accountable for the technology that they're using. It's very costly. This is public money. I want children to be safe. I want schools to be able to employ people safely and make sure the right people are in the right job. Because as I've got older and as I've had more and more experience in and outside of schools, inside and outside, things that provide, organisations that provide things for disabled people, is I know that doing the best for disabled people is not always the main motivator for people who work with people like my son. So that's where I have increasingly come from. That yes, most teachers, I have never yet met a teacher who doesn't want to do their best for every single child in their class. But I meet a lot of teachers who look at the GCSE curriculum, they look at SATs, they might look at phonics, and they despair. Because those things are where value is held, and they know that that's not how we value our young people. So yeah, it's more than a welcoming attitude. And I guess I would say it's one thing I did. I do like a blog. I mean, you could probably tell from this that I am quite tired. Obviously, I am a teacher and I am working in the field of special needs and disabilities. So I am like super tired, and it's the end of term tomorrow. But I did at one stage, and I can't remember when it was. It was probably about 8 to 10 years ago. Write a blog called "What It's Not," because there's a lot of things on the surface that might make a school feel that it's it's an inclusive school. And I found it in my book because I couldn't find it in my blog, and it says it's not saying that everyone is welcome, and then being flummoxed as to what to do when children turn up and then you put them in a corner or out in the corridor with a special helper and a box of cars, some crayons or an iPad. It's not having the same expectations for children with SEND as for the rest of the class in the name of aspirational targets. It's not making allowances for differences in behaviour, because that would be singling them out for special treatment. And it's not making excuses either. It's not letting them get away. Oh, I've obviously written this. It's not letting them get away with whatever they please because you feel sorry for them. It's not rushing on before you've checked they're ready, because that's the next thing to learn on the list. Children with special needs, and certainly with my experience with my son, can take much longer than you might think to grasp a concept and generalise it. And it's not saying everything is all right when it isn't, because that's what you think people want to hear. And it's definitely not everybody learn Makaton for the Christmas assembly. Okay, so I'm going to stop now, because I could carry on for some time, but I hope I've given you something a little bit different to think about. I've tried to take a different perspective and have a look at it from a different point of view.
No, thank you. That's great. And yeah, I know lots of people who would say syllabus is at the heart of many of the issues we face in terms of success for children with special needs at schools. And
can I just say there's one other thing that I thought, I mean, I different experiences with my son, in that we sent him to a mainstream primary school, which is the primary school up the road, because isn't that the best? Isn't that the thing we all want? Is for our children to go to their local school and be part of their community. That's what I wanted. And then we sent him to a special school for secondary, and I got a different perspective on what inclusion, because it then became about his experience in the school. So I would say there is an element of an inclusive school allows children to participate in all parts of the school. You know, they're not sat in a corridor, they're not sitting to one side, they are able to participate in some way and feel that they belong to that school. So to be an inclusive school, you've got to be listening to the children, you've got to be listening and learning from them, you know, learning what they want.
Brilliant, thank you. And I forgot to say earlier, we will be sending around a load of links relating. I mean, there's lots of things we will send around IPSEA's website, some of the Twitter accounts, Nancy's blog. So yeah, we'll send some stuff out. And although we'll cover questions later, if you suddenly have a question that's burning, I mean, do put it in the chat. We'll pick up the questions, anything that's written down. I wonder when you'd turn up.
What's that?
I don't think I've not had a single webinar in the last 2 years without this guest. Right, are you ready to? I'm going to put you on mute now. All right. The perfect timing for me to shut up and hand you over to our final guest, Tom Rees.
Good evening, everyone. It's really nice to be here. Hopefully, I can build on a couple of things that have been said already this evening by Alex and Nancy in their super interesting and insightful presentations. So 2 things that really struck me. One from Alex, who talked, I think I'll get this right, Alex, about not seeing this challenge of inclusion as a problem to be solved and as something that's negative to respond to. And then also, Nancy, there's so much that I recognise and experience from my time as a dad with Freddie, who's 18 this year, which feels ridiculous for us as a family. But Freddie, who you'll probably hear shortly because he's coming back from his swimming lesson. Nancy talked about, are we employing people with a good heart, but not necessarily with that expertise? I think that's a real challenge and a dichotomy for us, is that we quite often, schools, special schools, people who support people with Down syndrome, with disability more generally, it's often seen as a very kind and caring thing to do, but not necessarily an intellectual or an important or a professional thing to do. And so there's a real challenge for us, I think, about how we can think of kindness as a threshold, but not a ceiling, in terms of what it means to educate people with disability, and certainly with Down syndrome, which is what we're talking about tonight. So hopefully you can see my screen. Can I just get a thumbs up? Alex, can you see my slides there? I've got a few slides to skip through. The question was, what makes an inclusive school? The angle I'm going to take tonight is that we're going to talk a bit later about, you know, all the reform and the things that government are doing at the moment, and that's important and influential. But the angle I'd like to take today is to think a bit about what we're able to do independently of what the government might do. Because one of the things that I've come to think about over the years and in my work with schools and as a former head teacher and someone who worked in a multi-academy trust is that a lot of the conversation in and around schools focuses very much on what government need to do differently in order to solve problems. And that is important. Like, we should make sure that there is a healthy debate and challenge about what should happen at a government level, at a legal level, in order to improve things. However, it can't be the answer to every challenge with inclusion. And if the problem is always located with government to reform, and the idea is that, you know, things can only get better if there's more funding or the law changes or something very big happens that, you know, somewhere in central government, that will take a very long time. So the thing that I want to talk about today really is more about how within whatever legal framework we might have or government we might have a change of government over the next 18 months. What is it that is within the gift of schools to do and within the gift of teachers and parents to do to help make our schools more inclusive places? And that's the angle I'm going to take. So one of the things I've been thinking quite a bit about over the last couple of years is this question of what we can do. And there's a publication here which I wrote with a colleague, Ben Newmark, who has a daughter with Williams syndrome. We wrote this last year. It's called A Good Life Towards Greater Dignity for People with Learning Disability. And the essence of the paper is really to say that as well as all the legal things that might happen about funding and how it might distribute that more fairly and things about Ofsted and the accountability system and so on, there is a fundamentally more important question that we've got to try and answer at the moment, which is about dignity and is about how we can have a much broader conception of what a good life is and how we can value a great many number of things that are really important. And actually, I think that's important for children with Down syndrome. I think it's important for anyone who has a disability. I think it's important for people who don't have a disability. Like, I think that as Nancy says, there is a challenge in education at the moment, which is that we, for a number of understandable reasons, have become very focused on specific things that can be measured, a certain particular set of subjects, which are very, very important, but that isn't the totality of education. And there is if the question is what makes inclusive schools, the answer is that they focus and they are able to retain a focus on a much broader range of things. So I'm going to talk about 5 things which here it says could contribute to a better system. I think these are 5 things that underpin what an inclusive school is. And I'll talk through these now. So first of all, there's this principle of complete humans. So what we mean by that is that people and children in schools are not divided into different types. There is a challenge in the school system at the moment whereby we think often as SEND children or children with EHCPs or a certain category or whatever it might be as somehow different, that require something that is very different to what a school provides. And of course, we know that often children do need lots of additional help and support and adaptation, and that's important. But fundamentally, what we shouldn't do is try to categorize children with Down syndrome or disability as somehow something different. So our education system at the moment is still largely based on the medicalization, or the medical model of disability, which looks to categorization, to diagnosis. And ultimately, what that's really doing is saying education is struggling to include everyone. Therefore, there must be something wrong with the child. There must be something that is located in the child that is, we need to understand more about why that's different in order for education to be able to do its work. And that is a thing which we need to wrestle with. It's not just as simple as saying things like diagnosis is important. Of course they are. But it is important for us, I think, to say that difference and disability are normal aspects of humanity. These are things which happen in every inclusive school, in every village, in every school across the country. They aren't special. and they aren't things that require something that necessarily is different or requires a medical intervention. That's a big shift, I think, in our education system. It's what some of the best schools are doing already. The second thing, as I mentioned, is this idea of a broader conception of a good life, something which values different experiences and achievements. So our primary principle in society and in schools is around meritocracy. The idea that education really is a preparation for life, is a preparation to get a job. And in order to get a job, you need a particular set of credentials and academic qualifications which get you there. And that is a well-rehearsed narrative that dominates education. And, you know, for me, as a parent of Freddie, who's 18, who leaves school next year, this is just not, this is just not relevant. And actually, I would say some of the qualifications that Freddie is, is doing at schools they're not really necessary or relevant. I feel like we're just playing a bit of a game of, a certificate's important or some kind of qualifications important. I don't think that those qualifications really mean anything to Freddie, to us as his parents, or will help him with employment. I think we're just a bit stuck in education of thinking that the answer is always some sort of external qualification or accredited thing. And that distracts us away actually from what's really important to Freddie, what's important to Freddie's family, what's important to his community, and so on. So this is the sort of functional perspective of education which we're caught in, where we too easily just think about it as a means to an end, which is about academic credentials into workplace. And I think this is quite an ableist issue. So largely the education system is run by people who are successful in education. Teachers generally, well, almost entirely have degrees, did well at school. So we've got an education system that is run by and designed by people who did well in education. And, that largely, that is a contributing factor to the system as it is now. So we need to find a way of saying, okay, it's not having low standards to say that we need to think differently and more broadly about education and what things are important, this notion of a good life. So the third one is around inclusion and proximity. So we know, and all of you on this call will know, the joy that our children bring in to the world, into our families, into the community more broadly. And being an inclusive society requires us to think about disability as something which is normal, which exists in all of our communities and which we come into contact with. Scope's research on the disability perception gap in 2018 showed that people who knew someone with a learning disability were only between 2 and 5% likely to describe people with learning disability as getting in the way. For those who didn't know people with a learning disability, that rose to 10%. So you're more than 4 times more likely to think of people with learning disability as getting in the way if you don't know someone well. And similarly, a third of people who know someone with a learning disability agree that prejudice exists against learning disability. That falls to half of that for those who don't know someone with learning disability. So the point here is that proximity matters. It's really important that society and our education system and our schools are places where we come into contact with people who are different to us, and that helps us to have more inclusive attitudes and contributes to a more compassionate society. And number 4, and this I think is really important, the sort of point I made at the beginning was not always waiting for someone else to do something first before the world can change. So I think we as parents, as a charity, as schools, all have a great agency and responsibility to act. And a really constructive debate about a better future, I think, requires us to focus on what we can do and not what we can't do because of the way things that exist in society, and particularly at a school level. We should be pragmatic, of course, and we should continue to, of course, lobby for better law and policy and all those things. But in the meantime, I think there's lots that we can do to make things better in schools. And this leads me on to my final point, which is about more intelligent and dignified support for those who need it in schools. And I think one of the things that Nancy touched on in her talk, and that we are sort of increasingly understanding and uncomfortable with, is that the greater help you need in school, like the harder you find it to learn, typically the less time you're spending in contact with the most qualified professionals in your schools. And that's not to that's really not to say that teaching assistants or other adults who might work with people with disability don't do a really valuable job. I believe that they do and play an incredibly important role. But we do have a gap at the moment, which is between the level of expertise, which is directed towards those children who are more able or are achieving more highly, and those who are finding it difficult to learn. So I think there's something, and this is what the best schools, I think, do, the most inclusive schools do, where they really demand that the standard of education we expect for those who find learning hardest has to have the same high expectations and rigour which society demands for those children who achieve the most highly. So I think that's probably all I should say, because I'm conscious of time. We should get on to questions. There's a few schools here that I would like to point out: Dixon's Trinity Academy, Frank Wise School, River Learning Trust, some schools we've done some work with. Perhaps I'll talk about those a bit later. But I'll stop there, Chris, and hand back to you.
Brilliant, thank you. And yeah, I mean, those, I know that you've had a lot of there's been a lot of coverage of some of your presentations recently, Tom, on Twitter about some events you've been doing, and it's really interesting. Those 5 principles, it's a really interesting framework around looking at, actually, as you say, the national stuff happens or not, but you know, what is it we can do on the ground to make things better?